It gives me really great pleasure to introduce Dr. Elizabeth Economy, who has been a very important person in my life as someone who's taught me a great deal about China. She's worked at the Council on Foreign Relations for more than 2 decades. She's actually a local girl, if you will. She grew up in San Jose. She did her master's work at Stanford. And she's really, over the course of her career as a China watcher, has been basically one of the leading China watchers, not just in the United States, but in the global community of people who are interested about China. She has written a path-breaking book on China's pollution troubles, and now she's just come out with a new book called China's Third Revolution, which is basically on the government of Xi Jinping and his the challenge he presents and the opportunities he presents for the rest of the world. So with that, it really gives me great pleasure to be here with you. And I'd like to start the conversation off. We're going to talk basically for about a half an hour, and then we're going to take questions from the audience, initially in cards, and then we'll get them from Q&A directly from you. And then after the program, Liz will be available to sign books as well if you're interested in getting a signed copy of a very important book that she's written on China this time. So, Liz, I'd like to sort of throw it out there and basically ask you, what is the third revolution that we're looking at in China now?
Well, thanks, John. Thanks for the lovely introduction, and it is really great to be here in San Francisco. The third revolution really marks the end of the Deng era. Deng Xiaoping termed his own 30-year period of reform and opening up and low-profile foreign policy the second revolution. But with the entrance of Xi Jinping onto the stage in China as the general secretary and then president of the country, he really has launched something quite different, a very different set of reforms from those pursued by Deng Xiaoping. And I think the China that's emerging under him is far more repressive and authoritarian on the home front, but also more ambitious and expansive on the global stage. In some respects, he has flipped or upended Deng's reforms, almost the opposite of what Deng was doing.
So can you talk about some of the component parts of this revolution that he's trying to carry out?
Sure. So I think there are really 4 parts to the revolution. The first, which I think many of you have read about and seen about in the media, has to do with his consolidation of power. I think one of the most striking things, especially early on in Xi's tenure, was the degree to which he was able to consolidate institutional power in his own hands. One of the central elements of the Deng era was really the collective decision-making that had come into being as a result of sort of a reaction against the Mao era. And Xi Jinping, to some extent, has brought back that individual leadership. He began by assuming control of many of the most important commissions and committees within the government that sort of sit on top of the government bureaucracy and are responsible for setting overarching policy on things like economic reform or cyber or national security. He then moved to have different parts of the bureaucracy pledge fealty to himself, not just to the Communist Party, but to Xi Jinping himself. Then we saw just a year ago or so, not quite, back in October, that he decided not to signal who would be the successor to him in 2022 as General Secretary of the Communist Party, and that broke a 25-year tradition. Another surprise.
President for life. Yeah.
Well, now we've got President for life, right. That was General Secretary for life, which he could have been anyway, but right. President for life, right. And I think that's one of the most recent sort of moves that he's made was basically to amend the Constitution and to remove the 2-term limit for president so that he can stay on, even if he doesn't want to stay on for life, at least for a 3rd term or more. So that's really just one element right. of the revolution. I think a second is the deeper penetration of the Communist Party into Chinese society and into the Chinese economy. I think one of the hallmarks of the Deng era here, too, was really the withdrawal of the party from society and from the economy, from playing such a micromanaging role. and she has reintroduced the party. And I think we see that in a number of respects, from the surveillance system that's being instituted, but also the increasing role of the party committees within Chinese firms or within joint ventures, where they want the party to have a much stronger role in determining important decisions like investment decisions, not just meeting once a month to talk about the most recent, central directive.
Right.
So again, the second part is really a growing role for the Communist Party. Third, I would say, is just an effort to some extent to control more closely what's coming into the country, what I call a virtual wall of regulations and restrictions, where he tries to say, here's what can come in and here's what can go out. And by that I mean simply things like the law on the management of foreign NGOs.
Right.
Right. So before Xi Jinping took power, there were somewhat upwards of 7,000 foreign non-governmental organizations working in China on issues like environmental protection or public health or poverty alleviation. After the January 2017 law came into being, now there are roughly 300 some that have been registered. So maybe 4 to 5%, right, of the NGOs that had been active before now are legally registered. And then finally, it's just what I alluded to earlier, which is just the much more ambitious foreign policy. I think a big part of Xi Jinping's tenure to date and has been this idea of the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. And part of that has to do with reclaiming an element of China's centrality on the global stage. And so I think we see China through many initiatives, whether moving on sovereignty or Belt and Road or in global governance, really beginning to play a much more significant and active role.
So what would you say, how much of this current revolution do you think is really a fundamental break from the Deng/Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao era? And how much of it is a continuation? Because some of the things have a continuation of policy. They began to become aggressive in the South China Sea during the Hu Jintao period, but you've noted in your book that they didn't actually start militarizing the islands until 2015, which was directly under Xi Jinping's control. But how much is this basically what one could actually logically expect, and how much has really surprised you about what the direction China has changed?
I would say about 90% on the surprise factor and 10% on the continuity factor. I mean, certainly, I think, as you're suggesting, if you look back to 2008 and the global financial crisis, that really was an inflection point in terms of the way that many Chinese scholars and officials began to think about China and China's role on the global stage and its relationship with the United States, or to the United States in some respects. Because I think there had been a sense, certainly among some of the more hawkish Chinese analysts, that yes, China was going to surpass the United States at some point in the future. A lot of discussion about the 21st century as the Asian century, and by the Asian century meant China first, right, and maybe India sort of a distant second. But 2008 gave some Chinese officials and analysts the sense that transition from China rising and the United States declining was happening a lot more quickly than they had anticipated. I think they took a step back from that when the U.S. economy rebounded, and President Obama initiated the pivot or the rebalance in Asia. I think that we had the Trans-Pacific Partnership. There was a sense again that the United States was asserting itself within the region. So I think some of that element of a more ambitious foreign policy, a sense that China had a greater role to play, did begin earlier on. Yeah. But I think if you look at the anti-corruption campaign, right? Anti-corruption campaigns are a staple of China, really of Chinese history, not just even communist history. Yeah. Typically, they go for a year or two, maybe they wax, they wane. But Xi Jinping, every year more people have been arrested than the year before. This is a very robust anti-corruption campaign. I think last year over 500,000 people were arrested. And once you're arrested, you're basically done for, because they have 99% success rate in prosecution. So there's not much room for anything else. So
a source of envy, I can imagine, in capitals around the United States.
Yeah. Well, at least in Washington, maybe. But I do think so. I think you kind of expected when he walked in saying we're going to do this and this. A lot of it sounded the same.
Yeah.
right? And 2013 economic reform program, right, the third plenum of the 18th Party Congress. I mean, living in New York, I can tell you that the vast majority of business people in New York City, investment bankers and others, believed that Xi Jinping was going to ramp up economic reform, that this was a decisive moment. He was going to push forward with economic reform that had largely stalled toward the end of the Hu and One era. I think very few people anticipated that what we were going to see instead would be this reassertion of party control in the economy.
State-owned enterprises
and state-owned enterprises,
stronger,
right.
Okay.
But if anybody had bothered to read the document, the work plan very closely, they may have seen that it still said that the state, right, would retain a commanding role within the economy.
Yeah.
So that was always there, that duality. Yeah. So I think there were a lot of surprises with the advent of Xi Jinping.
Yeah. So, from your view, how does this third revolution that we're now in the midst of in China, what type of distinct challenges does it pose the United States? And how do they differ in a way than the challenges that were posed by the Deng era or by the Jiang Zemin Hu Jintao era? I mean, is China now becoming, in a way, an ideological counterpart or foe to of the United States, whether it wants to or not, or whether we want it to or not?
So I think it's worth having a discussion about whether there is a China model. As you know, this is a big area of discussion in the China field right now, and we should talk about it. But let me just start by maybe pointing out a couple of other ways in which I think that Xi Jinping's more ambitious foreign policy poses a challenge to the United States. I think first, there's a fairly deliberate effort to make progress on not only staking China's historical claims to sovereignty, but realizing them. And so, as you noted, right, in the South China Sea, we have a fairly aggressive policy of militarizing the 7 reefs and islands now that China commands. That's very different from what happened before. So I think that's one. Look at Taiwan, look at Hong Kong. I think there is a deliberate policy, a coercive policy mostly, to try to erode the autonomy of both of these islands, although there are some inducements as well on the Taiwan side, for example, saying they'll offer Taiwanese business people national treatment for their businesses, right, if they locate on the mainland. So, but an effort really to begin to reunify the mainland. And I think Xi Jinping has set this out, as a soft goal for 2049. That's a long ways away, but I think if you're living on Taiwan, it probably doesn't feel that far away. I think that's one issue that the United States has to think about. What is our role as China makes these moves in terms of sovereignty? A second is probably the Belt and Road Initiative, the grand scale plan for connectivity. And this is really potentially quite transformational, I think. China began with this idea of infrastructure connectivity, 68 nations, China connecting to the rest of Asia, the Middle East, Europe, and Africa. Now it's broadened it to the entire world is welcome to join the Belt and Road Initiative. But beyond that, there is an element of, the digital Belt and Road, right? So the satellite systems and fiber optic cables and e-commerce. There's renminbi internationalization, right? They want a lot of the trade deals to be settled in the Chinese currency as opposed to using the US dollar. There's a security component. So China now has a controlling or a majority stake in about 76, I think, by last count, 76 ports in 35 countries. And although the Chinese government says that these are all for commercial purposes, we've seen in a number of instances that after they gain the controlling stake, PLA Navy ships
shows up.
Exactly, show up for little visits. And then we come to the issue of the political model. And, does China have a political model? I think Xi Jinping is trying to develop a political model that's some kind of combination of, Confucius and Marx. We see this big Marxist study thing going on now with Marx's the celebration of his 200th birthday, and the Chinese experience, right? The People's Republic of China experience, some kind of fusion of all of those things. But in the meantime, if you look back to 2014 and since then, there have been a number of ideas put forward about what a China model is. And it's pretty straightforward. It's, focus on infrastructure, it's opening to the rest of the world economically, and it's political stability. And you can look and see now that China is in a number of countries in Africa, for example, Ethiopia, Namibia, Sudan, South Sudan, and a number of others, as well as Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, and then some countries in Latin America as well. They're training officials on how to manage propaganda, how to manage societies. And so, how this plays out exactly, I think remains to be seen, but I do think it's a type of first step, an initial effort, maybe to make the world safe for autocracy, as opposed to, Woodrow Wilson, make the world safe for democracy.
Right.
And I think the reason behind that is fairly straightforward, and that is that, when China looks to international governance, to global governance regimes like to try to develop the rules of the road on the internet, right, or on human rights, it helps to have allies, right, that will stand by it, so that if it wants to get its own views about internet sovereignty, for example, it can rely on a number of countries, because otherwise it's going to come against the United States and all of its, Western liberal democracy allies. So I think there's a very practical reason for China to be out there training these officials.
I think perhaps it might be resonating more deeply in the West as we go through our own personal crises about, our democratic system and the future of our economy. You write at length, very eloquently in your book about suggestions about how the United States might be able to deal with some of the challenges posed by, and the opportunities posed by China. Could you go into them a bit?
Sure.
I mean, we've had a tendency in America to often, when dealing with China, to go at it alone. But you clearly think that policy is well past its due date.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. On the opportunity front, let me be positive right up front. I think Xi Jinping's ambition actually offers the United States and other countries opportunities. I mean, Xi Jinping wants China to play a larger role on the global stage, a constructive role on the global stage. We were able to partner with China on climate change during the Obama administration. With a little bit of pressure, they stepped up to the plate to help work on Ebola. We've continued to work with China on disease prevention in Africa. The Iran deal, with some pressure, North Korea more recently. Xi Jinping stepped up at Davos, many of you probably remember, and called China the defender of globalization. That gives the United States and others some leverage, right? If Xi Jinping is going to say that China is a defender of globalization, that means that China is at the very least, right, permitting the free flow of capital, and maybe secondarily free flow of information and the other things that we tend to think go along with the globalized world. So that gives the rest of the world the chance to hold Xi accountable for his words, for his rhetoric. So I think there are some opportunities with Xi's greater ambition if we're ready to take advantage of them. I think, in part, if we're retreating from the global stage and from a leadership role, then that's not going to work very well, right? Yeah. But it may give some other countries in Europe that same opportunity. In terms of working with our allies, I think that's essential for two reasons. Number one, I think there's a tendency, particularly in Asia, but even more broadly, to take every conflict and make it this conflict between the United States and China, right? And everything becomes a battle to the death. And if you look at the media, and this is no offense to you, John, because you don't do this, but they tend to hype everything as some kind of battle, existential battle between the United States and China. It's a battle over, clean energy, the lead for clean energy. It's a battle for scores on a certain math test. I mean, there's nothing that cannot be reduced, it seems, to a competition between the United States and China. I think it's very unhealthy. Even when you look at the South China Sea, that is not a battle between the United States and China. That is technically a conflict between China and 5 other claimant states. Right?
Yeah, and we're not one of them.
And we're not one of them. Right. And we're there trying to continue our role in ensuring freedom of navigation, and happy to work with everybody on that basis. So one of the reasons that I think in terms of bringing allies and others, into the debate and the discussion with China is because I don't like how everything gets framed as a U.S.-China, battle. The other reason to do it, though, is because I think we're much more effective in the end.
Yeah.
And if you look, for example, in terms of the challenges that we're talking about with regard to trade right now, this is one of the big issues on the U.S.-China bilateral front. Every single one of those issues that President Trump is raising in terms of intellectual property theft or subsidies or technology, the acquisition of technology companies are felt by our European allies, for example, as well. And if you take a look at the European Chamber of Commerce reports and the U.S. American Chamber of Commerce reports, it's shocking that the percentages of the companies' responses across the board are virtually identical.
Yeah.
Within like a 1% difference in terms of how they feel about the challenges that are being posed by China. So I think there's strength in numbers, and I think when countries speak with a unified voice and try to negotiate with China, I think you have a much better chance of getting change that will actually stick as opposed to some agreement that then actually isn't followed through.
Right. And could you talk a little bit about your views on Trump's China policy? I mean, there have been people who've talked about Trump and China as Trump's real purpose, and actually his effect as an American president is to make China great again. And you've pushed back against that idea, partially because you don't it's not like, back to your point, it's not a zero-sum game we're playing with China now. But could you kind of spell out sort of your views on Trump and how he's handled China, and because it's so easy to hate him, he's actually had some successes, and we have to acknowledge that. As much as we're embarrassed to do so.
Right. He has. So, okay, I guess I think President Trump has been very effective at putting China on its back foot. I was in China at the end of March in Beijing for a set of discussions with some Chinese colleagues as part of a delegation to talk about areas of common purpose, how could we cooperate together. I have to say, for the first time, the Chinese were not very interested in the discussion. Actually, usually they'll come up with some ideas, we'll come up with some ideas, none of them actually ever come to fruition, but in any case, we try to get things on the agenda and move things forward. But this time they weren't really engaged in that aspect of the discussion. What they really wanted to talk about was what was going on with this administration. I think they felt as though they had gotten a kind of a beat on the president. They didn't think that the president was going to be easy to deal with, but they thought his unpredictability had kind of become predictable. But the events right before this visit, I think, were pretty shocking to them. Both the agreement between President Trump and President Kim to meet, they were very taken aback by that. The Taiwan Travel Act, which is this agreement, a law now that the president signed, had been put forward by Congress, that basically encourages U.S. officials, senior U.S. officials, to meet with senior Taiwanese officials. It's very upsetting to the Chinese. And then the tariffs, right? They had thought that, we had our 100-day plan. Now, granted, the comprehensive economic dialogue had stalled and the president had sort of taken it off the table, but I think they thought things were going to be pretty much just the way they were. So I think the president has done a good job of sort of breaking their sense of complacency. The question then becomes where to from here, and what are we going to get moving forward?
Right.
So
is this sort of putting them on the back foot actually going to result in any significant change in the relationship?
Right, or any significant wins for the United States.
Right.
I mean, we do have a win, I think, in North Korea already. If you just look back a year, we could say that President Trump at that point was talking about a preemptive strike against North Korea. So, everything is relative, and I consider this to be a very positive state of affairs relative to a year ago. Whether denuclearization materializes is obviously a much different and much bigger question. So I think that's what he's been good at so far. Let's wait to see whether this threat of tariffs, the long list of asks, actually turns into anything. Now we've bigfooted our way into the Taiwan issue, not only with the Taiwan Travel Act, but we've also agreed to license technology to Taiwan that will allow them to build their own attack submarines. And so there's more going on there. And we just said that the effort by mainland China to put pressure on international carriers to take Taiwan off as an independent entity is, how did Sarah Huckabee Sanders put it?
Orwellian nonsense.
Thank you, Orwellian nonsense, yes. Which I think is actually the right response, but what are we going to do about it?
Right. Yeah.
And
what will happen once the Chinese begin to pressure American carriers to change their tune?
We saw what they did to South Korea, to the department store latte, when we deployed THAAD in South Korea. That China put all sorts of economic coercive measures into place, and one could imagine a not overt boycott of United Airlines, for example, which has some important lines to China. Then we could, I suppose, turn back and go against China Southern or whatever. Right. It could turn into more of a trade war. Is that really the route that we want to go down? So I don't know how far, I guess, the president has actually played out some of the moves that he's initiated. I think, but he's definitely made things a little bit less certain for the Chinese.
Yeah. So in one of the discussions that was held over the weekend at the Committee of 100's annual meeting, which was held this year in Silicon Valley, there was some talk about, this idea of working together with European partners to really kind of confront some of China's bad, or troublesome behavior, and specifically in the economic front, in terms of the Chinese mercantilist policies or state-owned enterprise-led growth in China, which has blocked out a lot of foreign companies. And in the discussion, Charles Friedman, who's a very famous China watcher, was a former Defense Department official. He was Nixon's translator in China, basically said it's too late. It's too late to really kind of deal with China in this type of aggressive way. And the only way to deal with China, from his point of view, is to accept China's dominance of Asia and move on. And I'm curious about how your book obviously does not take that perspective at all. But that is a perspective that you do hear a lot in the United States. It's like, they own all our debt, we're toast, they're going to control AI, and it's just a matter of time. And how do you counter that view, which you hear a lot in the United States?
Yeah, well, first of all, they only own 5% of our debt, which is roughly the same amount that Japan owns.
Right.
I think you're right. There are scholars out there, not just Chas Freeman, who have put forward the idea that we should already accommodate China, right? Acknowledge that Asia is a sphere of influence of China, and begin a graceful withdrawal of some sort. Again, I think that ignores the fact that Asia is not ours to carve up with China, right? And there's Japan and there's India. And to the extent, for example, that the United States has remained largely agnostic about the Belt and Road Initiative, we haven't really developed any sort of counter-proposal, or we're not out there trying to compete with the Chinese. We're also not partnering aggressively with them on the Belt and Road. But if you look, Japan, India, Australia are all out there with their own initiatives. And, even Australia upended China's plan for Huawei to do these fiber optic cables from the Solomon Islands. And Australia said, right? And then there was talk about a base in Vanuatu, and Australia's like, So there's a lot of pushback from other regional powers. I don't think...
And even TPP, right? It's not dead.
Yeah, TPP's not dead.
But it
exists.
Right,
It just exists without us.
Yeah.
So I think it's... I don't know, it's premature, I guess, and I'm not quite sure I understand the reason behind a withdrawal at this point, and why at this juncture we should say to China, it's okay for you to practice all these mercantilist policies. The real point is, it's absolutely not okay now, because now, after 30 years of believing that as long as we modeled best behavior, basically, we remained open, we didn't adopt sort of reciprocity, behave the way that China did in terms of its markets and subsidies and things like that, that eventually China was going to look like us, right? Not just like us, but again, more like the Europeans. So now it hasn't happened. China's the second largest economy in the world, the largest trading partner for probably more countries than any other country. It is the largest trading power in the world. Now is not a good time to say you can do whatever you want. So I don't, as you know, I don't agree with the argument, and I really don't see the logic behind it.
Okay. So I have a couple of questions from the audience. The first one I think is a pretty interesting one. These various factions in the U.S. national security apparatus have shown a negative reaction to technology giants like Huawei and ZTE. I mean, there's now basically a ban on ZTE buying significant equipment in the United States. Can you comment on this negative reaction to them? And what do you think it's a relevant reaction? Do you think it's a legitimate reaction on the part of the national security apparatus in the U.S. to be worried about these technology giants? I mean, Huawei effectively has very limited business in this country, partially because of their association with the PLA, but for other reasons as well. So I'd like,
Right. I mean, I think the reason to have a negative feeling about Huawei or ZTE is really only to the extent that you might have the ability for Chinese technology companies to access sensitive U.S. information. That, to me, is the reason to be concerned about it. I'm not concerned about Chinese technology products competing with our products, but I am concerned about the ability of some of these companies, if they have access to our systems, right, to get information. What they'll do with that access, Right, what they'll do with that they'll do with that access. As far as the ZTE case is concerned, ZTE is taking, I guess, the U.S. government, right, to court. And I think that's perfect. Then we will see whether or not they responded correctly to the charges and did what they were supposed to do, or they did not. So I think that's the beauty, in some respects, of the U.S. system, and it affords ZTE that opportunity. So
to have their day in court, literally.
Exactly, right? Exactly. So I think that's the way it should be handled.
Another person has asked for a sort of sketch a bio of Xi Jinping in 2 minutes or less, but to sort of give us an idea of where he came from and how that might have impacted his way of governing. I mean, because this is a guy who was in Fujian, he was in Zhejiang, who were basically the hotbeds of Chinese entrepreneurial activity, and now he's governing very differently from that at least that mid-career experience. So
right.
I'm curious where you think it comes from.
Yeah, I mean, I think many people probably know Xi Jinping was a child of privilege. Basically, his father was a revolutionary alongside Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai. He occupied important positions in the government when it was first established in 1949. He was in charge of propaganda early on, and then he was appointed as the vice premier of the country. But then during the Cultural Revolution, when Mao Zedong, caused, all that tumult and, called for the Reds to rise up against the experts, and Xi Jinping's father was put in jail, and his sister was killed, and his mother denounced Xi, and he was sent down to the countryside. So pretty traumatic. And one might imagine that after all of that, Xi Jinping would somehow turn against the Communist Party. But instead, he did not. He spent 7 years in the village, and he reportedly applied for membership in the Communist Party 10 times. That's the number that's out there. I've seen it many times. I myself put multiple times just to be safe, because I haven't found any independent confirmation that it was 10 times. It took him a while because of his father's political challenges to be accepted, but he was. Then he went to Tsinghua, which of course is one of the most prestigious universities in the country, but he went at a time it was before they instituted the exam system in 1977. So he went when you were still doing a lot of Marxism and, you're part of the PLA and a worker, and there was a lot of ideological education that took place.
He didn't have to
when
take
he
China's
started.
version of the SAT. Let's just put it that
he did
way.
not. He
Right.
did not. Although I'm sure he would have done well. But in any case, he didn't have to do that. And then he began his, rise up the party ladder. As you point out, he served mostly in coastal provinces, the wealthier provinces, economically successful provinces. But nobody really talked about Xi Jinping as an economic reformer, right? There was never a sense that here, you look back, nobody was talking about, wow, all these bold initiatives that were being launched by Xi Jinping, as opposed to somebody like Zhao Ziyang, right?
Yeah.
What Xi Jinping talked a lot about when he rose up through the system was corruption. He actually placed a lot of importance, even as a provincial party secretary, talking about the need for officials to be clean and not to be engaged in government service as a way to make money and to advance oneself. So to me, that's the strain that I see him bringing to the leadership through his rise, not having to do with economics. I think he sat on top of those provinces. They were already successful. He didn't slow them down, but they were already thriving by the time he got there.
Yeah, so in that sense. Back to his third revolution, if you look at this wildly ambitious program, where do you see the problems developing? Because oftentimes when we write about China in the United States, and I know I'm guilty of this, it's either China's going to take over the world or China's going to slip on the banana peel and fall apart. And often the sort of the middle muddle through is actually what happens in the end. And I'm interested in your book, you lay out very clearly what the ambitions are in foreign policy, in innovation, in the internet control, in politics, et cetera. But where are the problems that China could run into? And what are the potentialities for this? It's not, I think the whole China collapse theory is probably going to be hopefully put to rest, but what are we looking at if China actually only succeeds in muddling through?
So I think there are a number of potential fissures in this beautiful model that is
the China solution, as it's called in the Chinese press now.
I think one would be if Xi Jinping cannot, and the rest of the Chinese leadership cannot manage to balance their competing economic priorities. So they want to deleverage the economy because they have amassed an enormous amount of debt, in particular corporate debt, but also government and rising household debt. So the debt to GDP levels have skyrocketed over the past 5 to 10 years. That's one very significant concern. He wants to address poverty, right, to, remove the remaining 70 million people from poverty, particularly in the countryside. He wants to address environmental protection. They have huge pension issues looming. They have a lot of economic problems. So,
and they have this demographic time bomb.
They have the demographic time bomb as well, right? And removing the sort of stricture of the one child has not yielded yet, anyway, the baby boom that they'd anticipated. Right. So they have all these pressures economically. I think, a shock to the system, a real economic slowdown, or a big environmental disaster, something that called into question Xi's legitimacy or the legitimacy of the Communist Party more broadly. I think that's one potential challenge that he faces. A second would be, a sort of broader societal pressure for greater openness. Because I do think that the degree to which he is repressing society, whether via the internet or this surveillance system, or even what's going to be coming down the pike in the social credit system, the trustworthy system. I think if
you've honked your car, you can't get on a train.
Exactly.
You smoked on a train, you're banned for a couple of months.
Yeah,
right?
you play too many video games, too many hours of video games.
Too much mahjong, you're not going to Beijing for the Winter Festival.
Right.
It happens.
Yeah, the funny part is it's true.
Yeah.
That's we're laughing, but it's not actually funny.
Yeah.
But I think they're broader groupings of society that we see emerging, right? Like the feminist movement.
Yeah.
And they refuse, women in China, young women in China refuse to be suppressed, refuse to be denied their own Me Too,
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and then we saw LGBT rights push back against Tencent
Right.
for trying to link homosexuality with pornography,
Right.
and say, discussions of homosexuality on the internet will be banned. And then they pushed back and they won. So I think environmental activists would be another one. I think there's the possibility for these larger societal movements that take place in every country. I've never understood this argument that somehow the Chinese people are different from people everywhere, that they don't have the same wishes and demands to have their voices heard for some reason. I think they do. So I think that's another potential challenge for Xi Jinping. And then the final one would be something that we just can't see. And she has amassed a lot of institutional authority. That's clear. What's not as clear is whether he's amassed as much personal loyalty and power, whether in the topmost leadership or down through some of the ranks that actually might matter. We just don't know that. And so if there are challenges, if there are problems, is it possible that there could be a real leadership split? I don't know the answer to that. But those are three different types of issues that I could see Xi Jinping facing.
And so when you look at the political issue, the potential for a leadership split, and then you take into account the fact that he's opened the way for himself to be president for life and party secretary for life, do you see that as a way of increasing the political stability or actually increasing the potential for political instability? Because he's dismantled the architecture that Deng created, and Deng created in reaction to Mao, because that was, from Deng's perspective, a source of real instability in China. So Deng created this architecture of collective leadership and term limits, et cetera. And now Xi has taken it down. I've read in China some Chinese pontificators arguing that actually this is good for China because we're in a very difficult transition. We need this long-term stability in order to deal with these other challenges which you've just delineated. But on the other side, what happens when he gets old and infirm and he's still in the big seat? Yeah. Then you have a Mao type situation where the factions will come out again. And I'm just curious as to when you look at that decision on his part, given the fact that right now Chinese politics is clearly a black box. We have no idea what's happening inside it. How do you then analyze this decision to say, I'm going to be here for a long time?
Well, so another thing that I spoke about when I was in China just at the end of March with some of my Chinese colleagues was this decision on the term limits. And my sense was there was a lot of unhappiness about it. And in particular among liberal Chinese intellectuals, they were quite distressed about this turn of events. And there was a proposal made, for example, within the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, which is the sort of shadow legislature where they tend to have a lot of reform-oriented proposals come through. So there was a proposal where decisions that were made at the top would undergo a review a year later to see whether or not they'd been good decisions. And this was put forward by somebody who was concerned that there would no longer be an opportunity to have different viewpoints aired, because of Xi Jinping's complete hold on power now. So apparently that idea was tabled for the time being. It's not actually going anywhere. But and then there were a lot of rumors that the retired officials, people like Zhu Rongji and Jiang Zemin, were unhappy with this turn of events as well. And so I think it's possible that we've underestimated the degree to which his amassing of this institutional power, he's created some significant pockets of discontent.
Right.
And you could look, could be liberal intellectuals, could be entrepreneurs, right, who aren't happy at the idea, technology entrepreneurs, that the party's going to come in and take 2% of their company and take a board seat and try to tell them what to do and take control of certain elements of, their investment decisions. I think there's a lot of concern about the direction in which she is moving the country. I don't know whether it's going to be because he's infirm and he's making terrible decisions that the people will come in at that moment and challenge him. It may happen sooner.
Yeah. Yeah. Could you talk a bit about the Made in China 2025? And that is something that is causing significant neuralgia in Washington. It was targeted by the Trump administration as a specific problem in the economic relationship. And could you talk about sort of how that illustrates some of China's ambitions and their mode of running an economy versus one we kind of have embraced in the West?
Sure. So Made in China 2025 is a plan of the Chinese government that was initiated in 2015 and goes till 2025. And the idea is basically to take 10 areas of cutting edge technology, everything from could be new materials to AI to bioengineering. And say that China wants to dominate these technologies at home so that Chinese firms will have, I think it's anywhere between 40 and 80%. They will command anywhere between 40 and 80% of the Chinese market at home by 2025 and also be very significant players on the global stage. And they will do this by acquiring technology abroad, by going out and buying other firms. Could be licensing technology, could be, offering subsidies to those companies, Chinese companies, to go out and acquire all those firms. So that at one point, I note in the book that Chinese firms were putting in bids to acquire one German firm per week. In the spring of 2016. The Germans became extremely concerned, right? Especially in robotics and things, because this was an area where the Germans had, good technological lead. And so
they came to the U.S. seeking advice.
Right. And again, another area where it's not all about the United States. So the Trump administration, I think, has correctly, right, said this is protectionism and it's not okay, right? And I think they're trying to go in part through WTO, but actually what they're doing right now is targeting it through that tariff. So the second round of tariffs after the steel and aluminum, the 1,300 products, I think it is, a lot of those have to do with parts of the Made in China 2025 technologies. So that's what we're trying to do. I don't know that we're going to be successful, and the Chinese, I think, have indicated they have absolutely no plan to change the Made in China 2025 program.
Because that's really actually, from their perspective, to misuse the Chinese expression, one of their core interests, because their basis of their economy is on this idea, this mercantilist idea of being able to control these markets, first in China and then moving overseas. So how does this...
I forgot to mention enforced technology transfer was the other element of that, like battery technology transfer for electric cars.
Which has been key to China's growth model. And so as somebody who has analyzed the relationship between America and China, you're stuck with this situation where the Chinese, we are now raising issues that are fundamental to, from their perspective, fundamental to their economic future. And we're saying you have to dismantle that. And they're saying, well, if we do that, then we could be toast. And so how do you is there a way to create a compromise over that type of issue, or are we really sailing into very murky waters with China going forward?
Well, so I think there are two different potential responses. One is what we're doing, not only with the tariff, but in terms of looking to broaden the remit of the CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. So that's where the government reviews potential acquisitions of companies that may have some sort of sensitive defense, national security orientation. But now the Trump administration is saying we're not just going to look at companies coming in to buy U.S. companies, but maybe to do joint ventures, maybe to just license technology. They're looking to really expand. It's not just targeted at China, but it's pretty much about China, to really expand the range of Chinese efforts to get U.S. technology, to acquire U.S. technology. And so that's one thing that we're trying to do. Another would be to do a bilateral investment treaty, right? And a free trade agreement with China. The downside of this is that we've been trying to do a bilateral investment treaty for a long time now.
Right.
And
from their perspective, actually, they already have a free trade agreement with us.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And so not clear that we'll be able to move quickly enough to affect Made in China 2025. Mm-hmm. But again, I think this is an area where working with our partners and bringing pressure to bear on China, this is an area where we might be able to have some success. Right? If all companies refuse to succumb to forced technology transfer in order to do business in China, that will also slow down the advantages of Made in China 2025. Mm-hmm. But there's not much space, I would say, for a compromise when it comes to this kind of behavior. Mm-hmm. And again, I think the challenge now is, in contrast to China a decade or 15 years ago, China is a huge economy.
Yeah, it's
and
really
to say,
important.
Right, and
yeah.
to say that China's going to command, the domestic market for all of these technologies, the China market is a huge market. So that's very meaningful to the rest of the, foreign, to multinationals.
Yeah. So as we look at China and its increasing complexity and its increasing importance, it's incumbent on us to have people in government who know the country well and can articulate a policy towards China. And where do you think is that policy being articulated now in Washington? And what's your sense of the level of expertise vis-a-vis China among the people in the Trump administration with whom you interact? There's several questions that are worried about that.
I see. Okay. I would say that at the level of Assistant Secretary of State, Assistant Secretary of Defense, the National Security Advisor in charge of Asia, we have excellent people. I think our bureaucracies are populated with very knowledgeable people on China. One is a former, journalist colleague of yours, Matt Pottinger, who's just done a phenomenal job in the National Security Council. Randy Shriver, who is at Defense Department now, is somebody who's served in Beijing before and also in the Defense Department before, has a lot of expertise that he brings to the table. And Susan Thornton, who has been the acting Assistant Secretary for East Asia in the State Department, again, longtime China hand. And they don't all share the same exact perspective, so we can also be assured that there's a healthy debate going on among these actors. At the more senior level, perhaps, expertise is not as great.
Mm-hmm.
But
that's a little disturbing.
Yeah, that's they're probably not as Asia-centered. But to be fair, in the Obama administration, there were also periods of time where we had very senior officials whose expertise was really not about Asia, much more about the Middle East or Africa. But this is a group that's pretty heavily weighted not on Asia, except I would say Lighthizer at USTR. I mean, he knows a lot about China. He's spent a lot of time doing trade negotiations with the Chinese back in the 1980s, I want to say. Yeah. So he's got a long history.
Yeah. I'd like to kind of go a little bit away from U.S.-China for at least one question and talk about China's relations with other countries in Asia, specifically its relations with India. Because there's recently a sort of a shirt-sleeves summit with Prime Minister Modi in the beautiful city of Wuhan. And I'm curious about your take on the relationship between these two giant Asian nations. And what's the trajectory there? What do you see the opportunities? And we now have a formulation in American political science speak. We're talking about the Indo-Pacific as a region. So obviously we're pulling India into there as, I guess, a de facto ally to bolster our ideas of engagement with the Chinese. But I'm curious about how you look at the relationship between New Delhi and Beijing and how's that going forward?
So I think the meeting in Wuhan was an effort to find some common ground in a relationship that had become increasingly fraught and tense. And they did. They're talking about doing perhaps some joint work in Afghanistan, some development work in Afghanistan. They're talking about at least, having sort of trying to reduce tensions along the border dispute, putting it aside for a little while, not focusing on that.
And it's actually China's only territorial, only continental border that's not settled, right?
Right, yeah. That's right.
They've settled everything else with the Russians, the Vietnamese, everything. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Territorial. Yes, right, we're talking about South China Sea.
Not
exactly.
Ocean.
Not
that's
South,
different.
Right. Not maritime. But I think fundamentally the relationship is a difficult one. And I think if you look at the Belt and Road Initiative, India has been one of the countries that's been most active in pushing back. It's quite concerned about China's efforts in the way that it sees it to encircle India, right? And it could be, Nepal and traditional sort of Indian allies and Sri Lanka and the Maldives and that old idea that came out of Booz Allen Hamilton about the string of pearls, right? Where China was going to develop ports all along through the Indian Ocean, now seems to be coming true. Yeah. I mean, people mocked the idea, but in point of fact, kind of is what the Chinese are doing, and the Indians are quite concerned about that. So India and Japan actually have their own, I want to get it right, growth Africa, what is it, Japan, India, Africa growth corridor idea, which is basically they're going to work together.
It's their Belt and Road.
It's their Belt and Road in Africa. Yeah. And India has become far more active in its own neighborhood, going out and trying to do projects and to ensure that, its relationships remain strong in the face of what it perceives to be, pretty active incursions by China. So I don't see the relationship moving much further in a positive direction. I think this was an important effort just to try to keep tensions from, boiling over. But I think there's very serious competition underway. Yeah.
And finally, we have just a couple minutes left in this taped version of the program. We'll get to some direct Q&A in a second. I'd like you to reflect on something that you touched on earlier, which was this idea that many people had that China was on a trajectory to become not more like us, but a more liberal economy, a more liberal political system. And do you think that idea was delusional, or do you actually think that China was on that trajectory actually, and then something happened and Xi Jinping came along and then kind of it took a I guess a left turn or a right turn, whatever, let's just say, or a U-turn, or that there were actually forces in China that were really not interested in any type of confluence with the systems of the West, and were actually quite strong all along, and we underestimated their strength.
So certainly I don't think it's delusional, because I was one of those people that thought that they were moving in that direction. And I think if you look back to 2010, 2011, even 2012, if you just look at the internet, you would find an incredibly vibrant political space on China's internet at that time. And you could look at the environment, because the decision by Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang to take on the environment, to take on air pollution, was a direct function of the pressure that emanated from the internet around this issue of environmental protection. And you had people like Pan Shi, right, the sort of billionaire Chinese real estate developer who was calling on the internet, holding polls, right, and saying how many people want to have the environmental issue addressed now and not in 10 or 15 years. And
should we have a Clean Air Act?
Exactly. So, I mean, this was all taking place there. I look, when there were the Beijing floods, I mean, this was one of the most amazing moments in time for me as a China watcher, was to see what happened when Beijing had these terrible floods in 2012. And the people in Beijing just connected. I don't even know, were you there at the time, John? Yeah. Right. Connected on the internet and opened their homes and, gave people alerts as to where the water was most severe, and it was incredible, right? And then in 2016, you had the floods in Hebei, right? I think it was, now I'm forgetting. Anyway, and instead, you had the government in there censoring everything, and you couldn't have the same kind of community development. So I just look at that one difference. It's like a light switch that was on and then went off. And to the point of whether or not we underestimated the degree to which there were still repressive forces, right? Forces that didn't want to move in this direction. That's probably true. I will say that when the sort of new Chinese leadership lineup was first announced in 2012, and Xi Jinping came out as general secretary, I was in Dubai with a lot of Chinese scholars and officials participating in part of this international forum and discussion. And I was one of only a few foreigners in the room, actually. There are probably 60 Chinese there. And I said, so what does this all mean? Who are these guys? What do you think about them? And they were all they said, this is a very conservative group. So in the sort of the range of people that could have moved into that top leadership at that very moment, right, the ones that came to power were among the most conservative. So I look upon that moment as a fairly definitive one, because I think you could have taken from a different segment of that very top leadership and ended up with a very different Chinese Standing Committee that would have produced a very different China today.
So with that, we're going to end the taped version of our program, and we're going to move into Q&A. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. That was great.